Wonderful. Thank you. So, well, once again, thank you for joining us this morning. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the question that we're going to all think about, which is about inflation. But before we do that, obviously, I want to make sure that we understand the relevance of what we're going to be thinking about. Let me just quickly share my screen here. See if I can get it to go to presentation mode. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick us off a little bit with the specific element in the news. So what you should see now is a link to a Straits Times article and just a snapshot of the article. I'm going to encourage everyone to just click on that link if possible. If not, I hope it's possible. Otherwise, you have to type it in. Does the link work? Not.
I think we may have to type in the link. Perhaps you could send it within the chat and then we can all access it from there.
That.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jamus.
Alrighty. So hopefully you guys were able to make it through the piece. Let me just show like a brief 2.5 minute video that also has some of these.
Singapore's core inflation in April has risen to a new 10-year high, driven by rising prices in food, retail, and energy. Economists expect prices to keep rising as borders reopen and tourism demand picks up. Isha Rodney reports.
Climbing costs have pushed Singapore's core inflation to 3.3% on year in April. This is a new high from the 2.9% in March and the highest since core consumer prices hit 3.5% in January 2012. Core inflation excludes accommodation and private transport costs. However, small increases in car prices have helped to keep overall inflation unchanged from the previous month at 5.4%. Economists say it's also thanks to the central bank's move to appreciate the Singapore dollar in April.
If we just compare this with the rest of the other global commodity prices, for example, oil prices has gone up by over 60%, in April, and we also saw that food inflation has gone up by almost 30%. Which means that the rather more expensive Singapore dollar really seen from the tightening of the monetary policy in the last 3 meetings by the MAS has been effective in mitigating inflation risk.
Still, bottlenecks in supply chains and high global commodity prices are expected to keep the pressure on inflation. And he adds that monetary policy alone will not be enough to cushion Singapore from the impact of rising global prices.
Our hands are tied in terms of trying to mitigate really global inflation, simply because we are a small player. We do not dictate oil prices. We do not dictate food prices. We are price takers. The only effective way, perhaps, really, is to go through the monetary policy and try to mitigate import prices.
Prices have risen across most major sectors, including accommodation, which saw stronger increases in housing rents. Industry experts expect costs to continue to increase as borders reopen, with greater consumer demand from inbound travelers. This is especially so for the services sector.
As travel activity normalizes, businesses may have scaled down on activities, but now they have to scale up rapidly again. So this brings along increased transaction costs. At the same time, when the demand is normalizing, it also can trigger higher price pressures.
For the full year, overall inflation is forecast to come in at between 4.5 and 5.5%.
Okay. So hopefully that
Singapore's core inflation in.
Let me just move on from there. That gives us a nice little snapshot of both the nature of what we are going to think about today. You have heard a number of terms, things like core inflation, headline inflation. You have heard the economists talk a little bit about the breakdown of separate categories, transportation, for instance, as well as food, some of which are accelerating at a much faster rate than others. But what I would like us to do at this stage is we're going to break us up into different groups. I think you've all been assigned to different groups. And yeah, I'm going to put a number of questions up for the groups to kind of just discuss when you're broken up into the groups. So I encourage you to just go ahead and see whether you can handle or tackle these questions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pop in and out of different rooms, and I'll give everyone maybe something like 8 to 10 minutes for them to discuss these things. And then what we'll do is we'll reconvene after that. We'll start a little bit of a seminar discussion where we raise some of these issues and we'll see what participants think.
Hi, Jamus. So I'll be creating the rooms. I know that there are 31 participants. So should I create 5 breakout rooms so that there are about maybe, 4 or 5 participants? Yeah, okay. So I'll create it. It will be automatically assigned. So please, join us in these rooms. So I'm going to create it now. Okay. There will be some of you who've just joined in. So Jasmine, if you could help to allocate those who've just joined in and assign them to a room for me, yeah?
Gotcha, no worries.
Okay, so I'm opening the room now. And how long do you want this room for actually?
Just about 8 to 10 minutes. Let's put 10 minutes and then I'll pop in and out. If we find that people seem to be done, then we can just forcibly close the rooms.
Okay, all right, 8 to 10 minutes, yeah? Okay, all right. I've opened the room already.
What they think inflation actually is, and how has it actually, to basically answer some of these questions. So I'm going to invite anyone that has some thoughts. Maybe you can unmute yourself, and I guess I can keep sharing my screen and then.
Thoughts. If you're too shy to turn on your camera, just let us know in the chat as well. Anything goes.
I think inflation is the decrease in purchasing power of consumers. So like you can see the cards, with the same amount of currency, you can buy less goods.
Yes, that's excellent. That is in fact one of the approaches. It is an interesting approach what you have done when you say it's a decrease in the purchasing power, because of course usually when economists think about inflation, we think about it from the perspective of increases in prices. But of course, the implication of an increase in price when you also have a fixed amount of income is that you have a decrease in the purchasing power of that given fixed income. Wonderful. So the point I wanted to make here actually is that we often see statistics which many of you may be familiar with, of the consumer price index. And I think it's very important to emphasize that inflation is actually not the price level. So the consumer price index will have a given number at this time, say 112. When we measure inflation, we measure it from, say, of the level of the consumer price index of 1 year relative usually to the year before, and that gives you a rate of change. If you're looking at monthly inflation, usually you look at it compared to the same month a year ago, just to take into account seasonal effects. But just the idea in general is that we want to look at the rate of change. And the other implication of what that means when you're looking at the rate of change rather than level is that in general, for inflation to actually persist, prices need to continue to rise over time. And so I think this is one of the things that is sometimes underappreciated, because of course, prices, they tend to evolve. And in order for, let's say the price of chicken rice, right? So because of the recent ban by Malaysia for chicken exports, chicken rice may go from $3 to $3.50. Now for inflation to actually be appreciable month after month, what you're saying is that the chicken rice has to go from $3.50 next month to $4 the following month to $4.50 the following month in order for you to actually have sustained inflation. And obviously that is a very, very strong implication, which is one reason why most economists believe most of the time that inflation will tend to dampen over time, because there's a tendency after the initial price shock for it to go away. Now, there are some different definitions of inflation. We saw that in the reading as well as in the as well as in the video. Anyone wants to share what they think the distinction is between headline and core inflation and why that matters? Nobody?
You can go ahead and, unmute yourself to share your thoughts, or, just key it down in the chat.
Maybe I can jump in. I think headline is probably with the biggest basket of goods, whereas core excludes private transport and perhaps accommodation.
Yes, thank you. So in fact, that is Singapore's definition of core. We have an interesting phenomenon in that Singapore measures its definition of core in a different way from how core is actually measured elsewhere. So as many of us may be familiar, a core elsewhere usually excludes the cost of both fuel as well as the cost of food. So Singapore doesn't actually do it in that specific way. They exclude rather accommodation as well as transportation. The argument, of course, is that transportation and accommodation are the biggest fluctuating components in Singapore's inflation basket, as opposed to elsewhere where it tends to be food as well as fuel. Whether you agree with that or not, I think it's useful to recognize this distinction that Singapore has in the measure of headline versus core, and to ask ourselves what it means when we say that our headline is significantly higher than our core, for instance, and our core for right now is something like 3.3, our headline is 5.1, 5.2. So the things that are really driving that difference between them isn't necessarily just in particular is going to be not so much food, because in Singapore the definition of core inflation doesn't exclude food, but rather it is things like accommodation. So when we look at the distinction between the two, in Singapore at least, we get a sense that really perhaps transportation is the one that is driving a lot of this increase in core versus headline. Now, you may also have seen, or rather I alluded to earlier on, a distinction between year-on-year versus annualized. Of course, the reason why economists tend to measure the change in inflation of, say, the month of April relative to April the year before is to just take into account the fact that we have seasonality, and these, in every given month, there may be certain routine pressures, right? You can imagine in February in Singapore during Chinese New Year, certain kinds of goods will tend to experience greater price pressure than others. So it's important to be comparing the change in prices relative to the same period a year earlier, because this tends to smooth out some of these month-to-month variations in consumer demand. Let me see if I can get us looking a little bit at how inflation has been. I'm just going to start us off by showing a few charts, and then maybe people can jump in if they have thoughts specifically about the patterns in Singapore. So what you see here is a long history of global inflation. You'll notice that, in fact, starting from the 1800s through till, say, the aftermath of the Second World War, which was about 1945, periods of inflation has been at least as frequent as periods of disinflation or deflation. So I think that's interesting to keep in mind because, of course, we are all much more accustomed to the possibility that, well, inflation occurs or inflation tends to be on the low side. But the notion of shrinking prices, that's something that, well, if you're Japanese, you probably have a little bit more experience of that. But if you happen to be to have grown up in Singapore, for instance, the notion of falling price levels altogether, that tends to be a little bit alien, but that isn't necessarily the case, at least in the long history of global inflation. Now, if you look more recently, of course, you'll notice that median inflation, both in developed markets as well as emerging markets, these have really trended upward. Interestingly, one thing I would like to draw your attention to is that if you look at the scales, you'll notice that the scale at the bottom, which is for emerging markets, tends to be drawn out more relative to the scale at the top. And that's not surprising. Usually in emerging markets, inflation tends to be on average a little bit higher. But what's interesting right now, if you look at the bands that you see in both of these, that's the distribution. So unsurprisingly, you see a greater variation among emerging economies. But if you look at median inflation in advanced economies, that's about 7%. And if you look at median inflation in emerging economies, it is also around about 7%. This convergence in the performance of median inflation is actually something unusual in even more recent history. More recent history, inflation in emerging economies has tended to be in the range of 4 to 6%, and then advanced economies much closer to 2%. You can see that actually a little bit also from the beginning of the period. And so this surge in median inflation is certainly one of the more recent phenomena that we have observed. Now, what about Singapore? Singapore has not been exempt. As the article, as well as what we've noticed here in just the data show, what I've plotted here is month-on-month inflation that is annualized. Again, you can measure this in various different ways, but you'll notice that at 5.4%, headline inflation is non-trivial in the context of Singapore. And of course, there have been periods in recent past, even as recently as the early 1970s, where inflation spiked to something like 35%. That, again, is not unusual given that in 1973, there was the first of two major oil price shocks. In 1973, there was the so-called Yom Kippur War. It was a period when a number of pan-Arab states decided to invade Israel. And as a result, there were global sanctions that led to the decision by oil exporting countries to restrict their exports of oil, and that led to huge lines for fuel. That hasn't happened quite yet today, but it led to huge lines of fuel and hence spikes in inflation globally, not just in the case of Singapore. Now, what about prospects? Well, that's what is on everybody's minds. This plots out annual inflation, so there's no longer looking at it from a shorter term period, but at least up to 2026, courtesy of the International Monetary Fund. Now, you may or may not believe their numbers, but I think this is consistent with a much more sanguine view of economists globally, that in the medium to long run, inflation is actually going to be a lot more contained. So what you see here is an inflation rate that actually is below 2%. And of course, at 5.4, that's not the current rate of inflation, but it's definitely something to keep in mind, and that is that at least professional forecasters still have inflation at a relatively contained rate in the medium to the long run. Okay, so why do we care? Oops. Let me just go back to presentation mode. So perhaps I can invite responses from the floor. Why, when you guys were discussing, why does inflation actually matter? Other than chicken rice wars.
Due to the decrease in our real income in general, you can see that we are able to buy like less good, able to afford less services, and there is definitely a decrease of our satisfaction, or like our general satisfaction or utilizations about yeah.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, the notion is that by being able to buy less, we obviously are not as happy as when we can buy more. But maybe I can prompt participants to think a little bit about the distributional implications. Does high inflation hit certain groups more than others?
Yes, hi, I'll jump in here. This is Sally. Yeah, in our small group, we were talking about how it impacts different segments of the population. I think it hits the lower income folks a lot more, than obviously the ones in the higher income or the wealthy people. It's not the same. And at a personal level, I wouldn't care about inflation if my salary adjustments are more than more than the inflation, let's say. So at a personal level, I may also care less if I'm able to earn more. But I think at a business level, how much of the inflationary cost pressures can be passed on to customers is the other question. So there are many angles to this. So we do care. We have to care from many levels, personal, society, and also business. Yeah.
Thank you, Sally. So indeed, what Sally, as well as I didn't quite get the name of the previous one that shared. Was it?
I believe it's Jingwen.
Jingwen. Yeah, wonderful. So obviously there is this issue, especially when it comes to the ones that are relatively richer versus those that are relatively poorer. The richer in general, even if inflation had no differences in terms of how it hit different parts of the basket, right? So for instance, you can imagine that if we said that the prices of everything from electricity to transportation to food to cars to housing, everything rose at exactly the same rate, say 5%, that will obviously hit the poor relatively more if they're on a fixed income, because of course items like food or transportation comprise a much bigger share of the household budget of those that are relatively poorer compared to the rich. So that is the obvious immediate implication. There's also another distributional implication that's sometimes not as well appreciated, and that is that if you are a borrower, typically, for instance, you will borrow at some fixed interest rate, 5%, 4%. Now, if inflation suddenly jumped to 10%, what that means is that as a borrower, in real terms, you have benefited from this outcome, because your interest rate is now in real terms lower than the increase in the generalized price level. And likewise, there is a redistribution in this case from creditors. So if you are someone that had lent money expecting a return of 5%, what that means if inflation turns out to be 10% is that you have actually lent at a negative interest rate relative to others. So obviously that is one of the consequences of having inflation that is higher than expected in terms of creditors versus debtors. And of course, we all are probably aware when we think about planning, whether you happen to be a business or a consumer, that this influences the way that the certainty by which businesses can go about planning for their activity. Principally, as you can imagine, businesses that are planning on selling their goods and services, because they also, remember, they will need to buy their inputs. If they're buying their inputs at a certain price, say they subsequently decide to sell what they produce at a given markup on what their costs were, that gets thrown off if inflation suddenly rises much higher, and they aren't able to adjust the prices because they have engaged in medium or long-term contracts to sell their goods at a given price. So this uncertainty tends to inhibit additional investment. So I don't know if anyone managed to think about what drives inflation. Do participants have some thoughts about what they think gives rise to inflation and inflationary activity?
Can chip in from my group. I think you know, in each of the particular markets that we're talking about, be it energy, be it food, etc., there are underlying supply or demand issues that might drive the costs up. You can also have monetary explanations for inflation. But I think just in terms of the recent news for Singapore, let's say energy, right? I think the feedback from my group is a lot of it is kind of as a result of the sort of geopolitical developments in Ukraine and actions of OPEC. That's having an impact on the gas and oil markets. So that's contributing to one element of inflation here.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you, Jason. As a matter of fact, economists often distinguish between what's sometimes known as cost push inflation versus demand pull inflation. So the cost pull inflation is just the idea that inflation gets pulled up when your inputs, which contribute to costs, end up rising. And actually, for economists, cost push inflation is a little bit less worrying, mainly because if you have a situation where costs are rising, typically, for instance, as Jason mentioned, resulting from an unexpected shock like a war, usually you don't expect this kind of increase, this one-time this increase in cost to be continuous. So what happens is, okay, you have a war that results and that reduces significantly the amount of wheat that is available in the world because both the Ukraine and Russia are major exporters of wheat. That leads to a shock that increases the cost of wheat and hence bread and so on and so forth. Once producers take this into account, what usually happens is that they are not going to adjust it again unless you have yet another shock. And once that reduction in supply has already occurred, unless it continues to reduce, of course, that is entirely possible if the war drags on and yet more supply gets taken out of the market. But if, as we see now, there's some kind of stagnation in conflict, what usually happens is that there's a stabilization in the market. What may even happen when prices rise as a result of a reduced supply is that other wheat producers elsewhere in the world can decide to make up for this. And eventually, this leads to a relaxation in these tight conditions for commodities. And so we have, in fact, observed that there are three main commodity classes: industrial metals, food, as well as energy. As it turns out, for industrial metals, we have already observed some kind of peak in recent times in terms of the price of industrial metals. Likewise, there's some indication that at least insofar as fuel is concerned, these have also begun to, the increase in the price of fuel has also begun to slow. And so in terms of this cost push inflation that comes from commodity inputs, that appears to be somewhat more contained in recent times. Now, what about other sources? Well, the other major source of cost, of course, is wages and unemployment. And although that has been less of the case in Singapore, in many parts of the world, especially in advanced economies like the United States, what we have observed is that wages have risen. Now, the reason why wages rising is a little bit more of a concern relative to commodity price rises is because, of course, as humans, we can keep adjusting our demands for wage increases, right? So what happens in that case is, especially in a given tight labor market, so unemployment is still at almost unprecedented lows in the post-pandemic period. And what that means is that as wages rise over time, and then wage demands rise over time, this gets factored into the prices that producers are charging. And that in turn means that if you are a worker, you're going to say, well, inflation is high, I need higher wages. And this leads to the dreaded so-called wage price spiral. As prices rise, workers demand higher wages, wages rise, that leads to increases in input prices, and then producers increase their pricing once again. And this is a little bit more pernicious, because this so-called demand pull inflation can become self-reinforcing. And this is what a lot of economists are currently staring at more carefully, whether we observe some kind of increase in unemployment. The increases in unemployment would tend to indicate the possibility that labor markets are starting to relieve some of their tightness, and this also in turn relieves some of that upward wage pressure that you observe. One final point I think I should point out is the role of expectations, and obviously expectations is exactly what drives the continued demand increases in demands for increased wages and so on. Okay, I think we are nearing the end, and I wanted to talk just briefly about how one would deal with inflation. Very quickly, there are a number of tools, both in terms of the common tool that central banks tend to employ are interest rate tools. So both at the short end as well as the longer end of the interest rate spectrum. So as some of us may be aware, they're both short-term interest rates. This is sometimes known as the policy rate. So central banks around the world, like the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank, they would adjust the short-term rate in which they make available funds to the banking system. They can also potentially affect longer-term rates. So these are like rates that go from 10 years onward, and they do so by a process known as quantitative easing. Basically, they buy and sell bonds that are dated with maturities 10 years or longer, and this the purchasing and selling of these bonds at the long end tends to influence the longer run interest rate as well. Now in Singapore, there is less of a usage of the interest rate tool and much more of a usage of an exchange rate tool. In fact, the Monetary Authority of Singapore officially targets not the interest rate, but rather the exchange rate, and the interest rate is adjusted to be subservient to the exchange rate reduce. Over the course of the past year or so, the Monetary Authority has already arguably allowed the target interest rate to rise 3 times, meaning that in principle, this should lead to an appreciation of the Singapore dollar. Unfortunately, if you look at the data, this hasn't quite come to pass. In spite of their interventions, especially against the US dollar, the Sing dollar has actually weakened, and it is at a multi-year weak point relative to the recent past. Part of this is because the US dollar, as many of us may be aware, has appreciated globally. But what this means is that insofar as being able to use an appreciation of the Sing dollar to mitigate some of this inflationary pressures, because after all, if you have a stronger currency, the goods and services that you import from the rest of the world are relatively cheaper to you. That hasn't quite come to pass, and that's why we're still observing increases in the prices of the goods and services that we're importing, especially those that happen to be priced in the dollar, such as fuel. One final point is that in general, the central bank also has other tools that it can deploy to try to control the price level. It can try to restrict the amount of lending in the economy through adjusting reserve requirements in the banking system, for instance, and that in turn may slow down the rate of inflation because, of course, as most of us are aware, borrowing and lending is the lifeblood of economic activity, and slowdown in economic activity tends to also cool inflationary pressures. Okay, so I think my session is supposed to end at 10, so that does bring us to the end of my sharing, I think. I'm happy to take any questions that people may have. Otherwise, I'm going to hand us back off to Jasmine.